The series opens up by a young man called Ha Dong-soo who was walking along the street alone, but when he was walking, he was suddenly kidnapped by a group of gangsters. Ha Dong-soo became unconscious. A surgeon performed surgery on his body where his body was cut open and his internal organs, including his eyeballs, were removed. When his mutilated body parts were thrown out by the surgeon, something like this happened. Fortunately, all of that was only a dream. Ha Dong-soo was a part of human race called Connect. As a Connect being, he would never die, and if he got wounded, his wound would be healed in less than a second. Because of this special ability, Dong-soo managed to escape from the surgeon even though one of his eyeballs was left behind there. One morning, people were surprised when they saw a sculpture at the side of the road. They took some photos of the sculpture because they were astonished by it, but turned out, the amazing sculpture was actually a body of a dead woman. A cold-blooded psychopath had murdered, skinned, and dressed the woman as a sculpture. He also wrote his identity on the woman's body, which said PL. Dong-soo was playing his guitar. Suddenly, he felt pain in a part of his body where his eyeball was missing. It looked like he had a vision from his missing eye. It meant that someone had his missing eye. In his vision, Dong-soo saw a horoscope where there were symbols that looked like the symbols that were found on the body of the murder victim that morning. Since then, Dong-soo began to look for his missing eyeball. He realized that his missing eyeball was kept by the cold-blooded psychopath. So far, there had been 2 people who had been murdered by PL. The murder styles were identical. The police were confused because the murder victims weren't related to each other. They concluded that PL murdered them randomly. The next day, Dong-soo was working at a recycling factory that was owned by an elderly couple. He saw the elderly man being harassed by 3 young troublemakers. Dong-soo felt sorry for the elderly man, so he helped him. The 3 troublemakers beat Dong-soo up and cut his ear. They were surprised when they found out that Dong-soo didn't have an eyeball. Then, they called him Monster. Dong-soo became sad and mad at the same time when they called him Monster. Since he was a child, he had been ostracized by his friends because of his special ability. At night, Dong-soo encountered a group of gangsters that once kidnapped him. Those gangsters chased him immediately because they had found out about his special ability. Dong-soo managed to escape from them. He was rescued by a woman who wrote a novel about the Connects. She had been researching about the Connects, so she wanted to prove what she knew about them by injuring Dong-soo's leg and throwing Dong-soo's body away. At the same time, PL had found his next victim. Unexpectedly, the cold-blooded psychopath turned out to be an exemplary employee at his office. He was called Oh Jin-seop. At office, Jin-seop had a co-worker who seemed to have a crush on him. She was called Lee Sun-hee. When Jin-seop was talking with Sun-hee, Jin-seop suddenly felt pain in his eye. At the same time, Dong-soo suddenly saw what Jin-seop saw. Apparently, this condition was triggered by a song that Dong-soo made which was heard by Jin-seop. It seemed like his eye reacted to that song. Because of this, Dong-soo found a little clue about who was using his eyeball. So, Dong-soo went to Jin-seop's office. He recognized Sun-hee's face there and asked some questions to her. But Sun-hee was afraid of Dong-soo because she saw Dong-soo had lost his eyeball. She and her friend thought that Dong-soo was a bad person. Despite what had happened, Dong-soo refused to give up. He was determined to do anything he could to find his missing eyeball. Dong-soo remembered that Jin-seop was looking at a picture of horoscope in his vision, so, based on that clue, he came to meet a fortune teller to find out about the meaning of the picture. The fortune teller told him that the symbol of PL was a symbol for Pluto. There was something special about that planet. In a couple of weeks, Pluto and Venus would meet in a parallel line. This phenomenon was also called conjunction. After Dong-soo heard her explanation, he realized that Jin-seop had used conjunction time to murder his victims. This meant that the next murder would take place from December 25th to January 6th. On December 24th, Jin-seop was drawing a sketch of a middle-aged woman. His sketchbook contained sketches of his victims which he turned into artistic works. When he was busy drawing, suddenly Sun-hee came to his house. Sun-hee confessed her feeling to Jin-seop and wished that they could become closer to each other. At the same time, the fortune teller reported Dong-soo's visit to Detective Choi. Because of that, Detective Choi suspected that Dong-soo was the murderer. He suspected him even more when he knew that Dong-soo was often seen at the crime scenes. At Jin-seop's house, Sun-hee was curious with Jin-seop's workroom. She was shocked when she saw the sketchbook that contained the sketches of the victims who had been murdered and turned into artworks by Jin-seop. The next day, on December 25th, another sculpture that was made of human was found. When Sun-hee saw the news, she remembered a sketch that she saw in Jin-seop's sketchbook. At the same time, Dong Su was seen at the crime scene again. Unexpectedly, he encountered the gangsters from yesterday who had been looking for him there. The gangsters chased him immediately. Some policemen were also ordered to catch them. Fortunately, Dong Su was rescued again by the same novel writer from yesterday. The writer was called Choi I.H. Rang. At the office, Sunny asked Jin Sip to go to the rooftop with her. She had asked her co-worker to watch them there. Then, she asked Jin Sip about his sketchbook. At first, Jin Sip pretended like he didn't know anything, but when he realized that there was someone who was watching them, he took immediate action by throwing that man from the rooftop. Apparently, Dong Su could see everything that Jin Sip did. After that, Jin Sip also killed Sun Hee. Dong Su was furious when he saw what Jin Sip had done, so he went inside of the office building to catch Jin Sip. Dong Su saw Jin Sip entering a toilet. He followed him there. Jin Sip was annoyed by Dong Su. He stabbed his hand, but it was useless. Dong Su hadn't seen the face of the psychopath when the policeman came and caught him. The policeman suspected that Dong Su was a murderer. When Dong Su was being taken by the policeman to the police office, I.H. Rang came and rescued him again. Dong Su managed to escape from the policeman because of her. At the same time, the policeman watched a CCTV footage to see if Dong Su was a murderer or not. From the CCTV footage, they found out that Dong Su and I.H. Rang entered the office building at the same time after Sun Hee and her co-worker were killed. It meant that Dong Su and I.H. Rang were not the murderers. After that, Dong Su invited I.H. Rang to his house. At Dong Su's house, I.H. Rang told him about why she had been researching about the Connects. In the past, she almost got hit by a truck, but luckily, a Connect came and rescued her. Since then, she was looking for that Connect to thank him for rescuing her. I.H. Rang also said that she received information about Dong Su after she secretly listened to a conversation between the gangsters at their base. Dong Su finally told I.H. Rang about his connection to the cold-blooded psychopath who had been hunted recently. He wanted to catch the psychopath and bring his eyeball back. Jin Sip and Dong Su realized that the missing eyeball reacted to Dong Su's voice because it reacted to a song that Dong Su had created and uploaded on YouTube. Surprisingly, the song was liked by many people, including a music producer who had been looking for the creator and the singer of the song. At the base of the gangsters were looking for any information about Jin Sip because Jin Sip had an eyeball of a Connect. When they were having conversation, they found a spy listening device that was planted by I.H. Rang there. They became furious when they realized that I.H. Rang had been listening to them secretly all this time. At the same time, Dong Su had a vision again. Jin Sip connected to him purposely to show him the sketch that he was drawing. Apparently, he was drawing Dong Su's face and writing something that said he would find Dong Su soon. Jin Sip also showed Dong Su his next murder plan. His next victims would be 3 young girls. At night, Dong Su listened to a voice of a street musician who was singing his song. When he had a vision, he saw Jin Sip watching him from afar. He tried to catch Jin Sip's car, but he was caught by some policemen. Jin Sip came to meet the surgeon. He beat the surgeon up and asked why his eyeball was replaced with an eyeball of a Connect. Because the surgeon didn't want to get murdered, he told Jin Sip about what actually happened. At night when Dong Su was kidnapped by the gangsters, Jin Sip visited the surgeon because he was wounded. At first, the surgeon refused to help Jin Sip. Jin Sip said that he would pay how much the surgeon wanted if the surgeon agreed to perform surgery on him. Jin Sip suffered from advanced cancer at that time, so he didn't have much time to live. After the surgeon heard what Jin Sip said, he finally agreed to help Jin Sip. He did an experiment with Dong Su's eyeball that was left behind. After Jin Sip heard an explanation from the surgeon, he killed the surgeon immediately. At the hospital, Dong Su was interrogated by Detective Choi and his colleague. Dong Su told them about the truth, but Detective Choi's colleague didn't believe him. Detective Choi finally asked Dong Su to go to the rooftop with him so Dong Su could tell him about everything. Dong Su told him about the murder plan that would be executed by the psychopath. He also told him that the next victims would be 3 young girls. After Detective Choi heard that, he asked Dong Su not to get involved with this murder case anymore. He said that it would be better if this case was handled by the police. Dong Su refused his request because he was the person who knew best about the psychopath. After that, he escaped from that place by jumping from the rooftop. That night, Dong Su burned some schools in that area so the students wouldn't come to their schools tomorrow. Because of that, Jin Sip changed his murder plan with another murder plan. Dong Su met I.H. Rang who had been waiting for him in front of his house. I.H. Rang said that she wanted to tell Dong Su about something. Surprisingly, I.H. Rang told Dong Su that she was actually a Connect. Dong Su was glad when he found out about that because turned out he wasn't alone in this world. Don Su and IH Rang injured their hands to connect their body cells to each other. The next day, Don Su had another vision from Jin Sip. Because Jin Sip's initial plan had failed, Jin Sip showed Don Su about his next victim. This time, Jin Sip caught a music producer called Z who had rearranged Don Su's song. Jin Sip asked Don Su to come to meet him if Don Su didn't want Z to get murdered by him. He also slit Z's chest purposely to make Don Su angry. Don Su got frustrated when he saw that because he had caused an innocent person like Z to get involved in this problem. When he was going to save Z, he received a message from the gangsters that said that they had beaten his boss up. They threatened to kill the elderly man if Don Su didn't surrender himself to them. One of the reasons they did this was because they hated IH Rang, so they planned to catch both Don Su and IH Rang. IH Rang told Don Su to save the elderly man, meanwhile she would stay there to fight all of those gangsters. As Don Su arrived at his workplace, he saved his boss immediately, but suddenly his head got hit until he passed out. When he woke up, he found himself was tied with a chain. Then, he cut the chain by using an abrasive saw to free himself. At the same time, IH Rang was attacked by the gangsters. She was finally caught and interrogated by them. Then, a gangster slit her face because she refused to tell them about the truth. Because of that, the gangsters found out that IH Rang was also a connect. IH Rang fought those gangsters and ran away from that place. After Don Su saved his boss, he apologized to him because he had made all of this happen. At first, the elderly man thought that Don Su was a monster, but then he thanked Don Su and told him to solve the problem he was facing. At the same time, some policemen found a dead body of a thug called Wu Jin. Wu Jin's dead body was found with a camera which contained some photos of Jin Sip. Apparently, Wu Jin was assigned to spy on Jin Sip, but he ended up getting murdered while he was doing his mission. The police thought that Jin Sip was the one who murdered him. Turned out, the real murderer was IH Rang. IH Rang killed Wu Jin deliberately so the police would suspect that Jin Sip was a murderer. It seemed like her strategy worked. When Don Su and IH Rang were hiding, Don Su had another vision from Jin Sip. By using his blood, Jin Sip was writing the location and time for Don Su to come to meet him. After that, Don Su came to the location that had been chosen. As Jin Sip arrived there, he got out of a car with a costume and a mask. Apparently, Jin Sip had prepared a deadly toxic gas at that place to kill Don Su. He thought that if Don Su couldn't die because of injury, Don Su would probably die because of toxic gas. Because of the toxic gas, Don Su's heart slowed down and stopped beating for a moment. But not long after that, his heart was beating again. While Don Su was being unconscious, Jin Sip was taking him to his place. On their way there, Jin Sip told Don Su about why he did all of this. After he found out about the connects, he was thinking to do an experiment with his dying body. He wondered what would happen if he took Don Su's body but kept his face and brain with him. He wondered if it would stop him from dying or turn him into a connect instead. At the same time, IH Rang met someone called Kitten. Apparently, Kitten was also a connect like IH Rang and Don Su. IH Rang woke Kitten up and asked him to get out of his hiding place. She said that it was the time for the connects to come out of their hiding places. They planned to kill anyone who wanted to use their bodies. At the police office, Detective Choi saw a CCTV footage that showed Jin Sip was attacking and kidnapping Z. Because of that CCTV footage, Detective Choi believed that Jin Sip was the cold-blooded psychopath. At the same time, Don Su arrived at Jin Sip's place where Jin Sip made his artistic works. This time, the victim was the surgeon who was getting hung on a cross. Jin Sip said that the surgeon was the person who introduced them to each other. It seemed like they were destined to meet each other because Jin Sip had been dying and Don Su had been hiding from the world all this time. Because of that, Jin Sip offered to integrate Don Su's body with his head. Because he knew that Don Su would refuse, he tried to find another way. He brought Z in front of them and used him as a threat. He threatened to kill Z if Don Su refused his offer. Don Su felt guilty when he saw Z's bad condition. Then, Jin Sip did his experiment to Don Su. He cut Don Su's little finger and replaced it with Z's little finger. From that experiment, Jin Sip believed that the integration of his head in Don Su's body would be successful. A couple of hours later, Don Su woke up and found himself was inside of a freezer with Z. Don Su apologized to Z because he had made all of this happen. Z also apologized to Don Su because he was unable to help him to catch the cold-blooded psychopath. After he apologized, he finally died in front of Don Su. Don Su became furious because of that. He cut his hands to free himself. IH Rang and Kitten came to the base of the gangsters. Because of their special abilities, they managed to murder all gangsters there. After that, IH Rang and Kitten went to Jean Sip's place. IH Rang tried to save Don Su, who was trapped inside of a freezer there. While she was doing that, she was suddenly caught and attacked by Jean Sip. After Jean Sip saw IH Rang's wound was healed in less than a second, he realized that IH Rang was a Connect. Jean Sip had a new lunatic idea when he found out about that. He wondered what would happen if Don Su and IH Rang had a kid, and what would happen if he and IH Rang had a kid. He wondered what would happen to their kids. IH Rang was angry when she heard that. She attacked Jean Sip immediately. Even though she got injured for so many times, she still survived because her injuries were healed quickly. Not long after that, Detective Choi and his colleague arrived at that place. Jean Sip was afraid when he heard them coming, so he decided to run away. After that, IH Rang saved Don Su quickly. Don Su chased Jean Sip immediately to end all of this. Jean Sip was hiding in a place. He killed a detective who almost caught him. At the same time, Kitten attacked Detective Choi because he thought the detective would harm him. Luckily, IH Rang came at the right time and explained everything to Detective Choi. She said that the Connects wouldn't hide from the world anymore, and the Connects would show their special abilities to everyone from now on. She also said that Detective Choi shouldn't stop them if he didn't want to get murdered. Detective Choi said that he didn't care with the Connects and that he only wanted to catch the cold-blooded psychopath. Don Su finally found and faced Jean Sip. Jean Sip shot Don Su repeatedly, but it was useless. He also shot Don Su's eye, but it was healed in less than a second. Don Su took advantage of that situation by taking his eyeball from Jean Sip's body. After he got his eyeball back, he planned to kill Jean Sip. When he was about to kill Jean Sip, Detective Choi suddenly came and stopped him. He said that the police would arrest Don Su for committing murder if Don Su killed Jean Sip. He told Don Su to trust the police to handle this case. Detective Choi told Don Su and IH Rang to leave that place because a SWAT team would arrive there soon. When Don Su and IH Rang were about to run away, some helicopters arrived and surrounded that place.